Today we're at the Symphorien cemetery just outside Mons, a truly fascinating cemetery. Buried here we have British soldiers, Canadian soldiers, German soldiers, the first recipient of the Victoria Cross in the Great War, the first and last Commonwealth casualties of the Great War, a man who is often believed to be the first Iron Cross recipient of the Great War, all in one cemetery. This truly is one of the most fascinating cemeteries on the Western Front, and today we're going to go and explore. Symphorien Cemetery was established by the German army during the Great War. In 1916, a couple of years after the Battle of Mons, a German soldier was wandering the fields and the farmland here looking for a place to bury his comrades from the Battle of Mons, men who had been cleared from that battlefield from a couple of years before. He ran into a farmer in this area who was willing to help and offered this piece of land here. This used to be an old quarry, and that farmer was willing to donate the land on the condition that this became a burial site for men of all nations and not just for German soldiers. The Germans agreed to that, and so the cemetery here was established, and the Germans buried their comrades here, but they also buried British soldiers here as well. The cemetery here remained in German hands up until the end of the war, and shortly after the war it came under the control of the Imperial War Graves Commission, now the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. There are 229 Commonwealth soldiers here and 284 German soldiers here. 105 of the burials here are unidentified. By the evening of the 22nd of August 1914, men of the British Expeditionary Force had dug in along their defensive positions along the Mons-Condé Canal. The next day they were attacked by the German army. Huge fighting and battle, which we've talked about in our previous videos in this series. But by the end of the 23rd of August, their positions had been almost completely overrun by the advancing Germans, and they were forced to withdraw from that position. Of course, a lot of men were killed in that fighting, both British and German soldiers. A lot of them lay here at the Symphorien cemetery, and as we walk around, we're going to tell a couple of their individual stories. Before we get into some of the individuals, we're just going to take a look in general, because as I've said, this is a really interesting cemetery, and I want to show you a couple of the things that we have here. So we talked about this area being a quarry, and you can kind of see that as soon as you walk in the gate. You come up these steps here, and this is kind of in the middle of farmland. And straight away you've got kind of different levels and different pathways that lead off. We've got this staircase that goes up, and there's another staircase further up that goes up to the obelisk there, which we're going to get to in just a minute. You've got the kind of signage that you are familiar with in a lot of these cemeteries, the Symphorien military cemetery sort of main sign, and that's a pathway that leads off to another section of the cemetery that we will get to later on, and a few other little bits of information as well. So we've just come up from the entrance, which is down here behind us, and kind of over here you can start to see one of the larger plots of the cemetery, where we'll get to in a minute. But I've just come up here to the obelisk at the top of the steps. So at the top of the steps here you've got this obelisk that kind of sits in the middle, and you start to get a real idea of the layout here as well, and we'll talk about the obelisk in just 1 second. But you can see the main plot down there, cross of sacrifice in the middle, another kind of smaller plot through in the back, and then other plots just down on this side of the hill as well. The obelisk itself in the middle has a German inscription on it, and fortunately I have Google, because I don't have the ability to read that myself. Although no, I'm not doing myself credit, some of that I could translate. But that says, in memory of the German and English soldiers who fell in action near Mons on the 23rd and 24th of August 1914. Men who fought each other through Mons, across that canal, men who now lie together here in peace at Symphorien Cemetery. So one of the things that makes this cemetery so interesting is the way it's laid out. It's all little nooks and crannies. So up the top there you can see the obelisk where we were stood before, and then if you come down the steps you come down into a plot of German graves. Then just beyond that, down this next set of steps, we've got some British graves, and there's a couple of little memorials down here we're going to talk about before we head up to this higher level up here. Part of the layout of this really makes it feel more like a memorial garden than it does a cemetery. And in fact, yeah, I would say that's a good way to describe it. It's beautiful, it really is. So just when you come down those steps, you come here to this interesting memorial here with 4 headstones next to it. And what this says is to the memory of these 4 soldiers of the British Empire who died in August 1914 as prisoners of war and were buried at the time in Oborg churchyard, but whose graves are now lost. Their glory shall not be blotted out. So that's these soldiers here, all killed in the Battle of Mons, 23rd, 24th, 25th and 26th of August. So I would imagine soldiers who were injured in that fighting at Mons, who were then taken prisoner and then died of their wounds. I don't know that to be factual, I'm guessing that's the case. And they've obviously then been buried at the churchyard and their graves are lost, so they are remembered here at Symphorien Cemetery. Okay, so we've just come up to the highest point of the cemetery, and the wind is strong up here, so if the noise affects the video, I apologise. But on one side here we've got the cross of sacrifice, like we're familiar with from a lot of the Commonwealth cemeteries. And on this side we have another little plot, a beautiful plot here with a view right out across the fields. Now, in our recent video in the series we talked about the story of Maurice Dees with the Royal Fusiliers. Well, in this section here we have a lot of graves of the Royal Fusiliers. So the obelisk here in the middle tells us that there are 53 English soldiers here in this area of the Royal Fusiliers, or the Royal Irish Regiment. And if you have a look at some of the headstones, of course we talked about Maurice Dees being killed on the 23rd of August. Well, here we have headstones of other men of the Royal Fusiliers. So here, for example, we've got Lance Sergeant Button of the Royal Fusiliers and Lance Sergeant Johnson of the Royal Fusiliers, both killed on the 23rd of August 1914, the same day as Maurice Dees. So these men very likely would have been killed fighting up by the bridge at Nimy Bridge by Mons, and then probably buried here by the Germans after the Battle of Mons. And just down from them we have quite a few unknown soldiers of the Royal Fusiliers. A soldier of the Great War, Royal Fusiliers. A soldier of the Great War, unknown sergeant of the Royal Fusiliers. A soldier of the Great War, Royal Fusiliers. So these men of the Royal Fusiliers are very likely all killed during the Battle of Mons, alongside Maurice Dees, and then buried here by the Germans after the battle. I'm not trying to sort of harp on about the layout of this cemetery, but it is just so interesting. We've now come into an area where there is a circle of headstones surrounding this central kind of obelisk in the middle. Now, some of these graves look like they don't have exact known locations, because a lot of them will say things like buried near this spot on top of them. But let's have a look. So the obelisk in the middle reads here repose, which repose is rest in peace, or rests. 46 English soldiers of the Royal Middlesex Regiment. Let's have a look. So here surrounding it we have some soldiers from the Middlesex Regiment, again killed in that fighting on the first day at the Battle of Mons, 23rd of August 1914. And we've got a couple who have known burial spots by the looks of it. Private Ross of the Middlesex Regiment and Private Brett, both killed on the 23rd of August. And then next to them we have Drummer Peck of the Middlesex Regiment, also killed on the 23rd of August, but buried near this spot. So probably the grave was damaged after it was initially buried here, after he was initially buried here, sorry. So they don't know the exact location, but they know it's somewhere near this spot. Okay, so from here my plan is to have a look at some individual soldiers who are buried here and tell some of their stories, because this is a cemetery that has some of the most fascinating individual stories of any cemetery I've been to. And more so, they're all in the same cemetery, which really is quite interesting. So let's go and tell some of those stories now. The first person we're going to be going to visit is just around this corner here on the other side of the cemetery. So let's go take a look. Now, to start telling the stories of some of the individual men who lay here, I actually come over to the far side of the cemetery, just by the fence looking out across the field. So I apologise if it is quite noisy here with the wind, but we'll try our best. The first grave we've come to is that of Private John Parr of the Middlesex Regiment, killed on the 21st of August 1914, and believed to be the first British casualty of the Great War. We talked about that in our last video when we talked about the last and first shot memorial. So of course there's a bit of a wider story to that, and some people would say maybe it's not the case, but nonetheless here at the cemetery, John Parr is here with the death date of the 21st of August 1914. So here we have the grave of Private John Parr, Middlesex Regiment, killed 21st of August 1914, here at St Symphorien Cemetery. Now, something that's very interesting about John Parr's grave is that just on the other side of this kind of walkway between the two, we actually have the next story that we're here to tell. So behind us over there, John Parr, the first British casualty of the Great War. And over here, we have Private George Ellison, believed to be the last British casualty of the Great War. Right next to each other. I find that fascinating. So George Ellison of the Royal Irish Lancers, he was killed on the 11th of November 1918 at about 9:30 in the morning. That's 90 minutes before the armistice came into effect. He was killed by sniper fire when he was patrolling woods just near to here by Mons, and he became the last British casualty of the Great War. Now, as we talked about at the beginning of this video, the idea of this cemetery and the request of the farmer who owned the land was that it would be a cemetery for soldiers of all nations. And so when you stand in the middle, you do see we're next to British headstones, just next to German headstones, and just beyond those more British headstones. This really is the case of a intermingled cemetery, and it's what makes it one of the most fascinating cemeteries. Of course, there's the stories and some very unique stories in this cemetery in particular, but just the way it's laid out and the nature of how it's put together, for me, makes it absolutely fascinating. Okay, so the next soldier whose story we've come to tell is somebody who we know already, because we've done a whole video about this on the channel. But this is the grave of a German soldier, Musketeer Oskar Neymar, who was killed on the 23rd of August 1914 during that battle at the Nimy Bridge, or just down from Nimy Bridge, when he bravely swum that Mons Condé Canal to open the swing bridge, and he was killed shortly after. Of course, as we know, his story is widely told as him being the first recipient of the Iron Cross in the Great War. But like we talked about in our last video, that is probably not actually the case. But nonetheless, here is the grave of a brave German soldier, Musketeer Oskar Neymar, killed 23rd of August 1914, just up the road from here at Mons. So kind of into one of these sort of larger sections of the cemetery here, there's a couple of graves that we've come to see, and the first one is just here behind me. So here we have the grave of Lieutenant Maurice Dees, with the VC next to his name, as we know from our previous video, the first recipient of the Victoria Cross during the Great War. with those brave actions at Nimy Bridge on the 23rd of August 1914. You can see the Victoria Cross marked on the grave. He was only 24 years old when he was killed here at Mons in the first few days of the fighting on the Western Front. So the next grave that we've come to is that of a Canadian soldier. This is the grave of Private George Lawrence Price of the 28th Battalion of the Canadian Infantry. He was killed on the 11th of November 1918, and in fact he was killed at 10:58 a.m. He was advancing forward just near Mons when he was killed by sniper fire, 2 minutes before the end of the Great War, before the armistice came into effect. And he is the last Commonwealth soldier to be killed in the whole of the Great War. So I'm not on my own here at the Symphorien Cemetery today. I'm also here with my friend Marcel, who runs the channel History War Cinema. If you guys haven't seen that channel, you absolutely should, because some of Marcel's best videos are when he has toured cemeteries and told some of the fascinating stories. So I fully expect his video to be a lot better than mine. But anyway, look, Marcel, what do you think of the cemetery? How have you found the visit today?
It was really interesting. Yeah, I've seen cemeteries, Commonwealth cemeteries, that where some German graves were as well, but
yeah,
it's almost 50-50, right, in the number of burials.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. You know, they're resting so close together, like where we're standing right now. You have all a bunch of Commonwealth graves, and if you turn around, you can see all those German graves. So that's really special.
There you go. So if you guys don't already know Marcel's channel, make sure you do. I'll link it in the description below, because he's going to have a good video coming here from the cemetery as well.
Do my best, yeah.
So I hope you guys enjoyed this look around the Symphorien cemetery at Mons. Of course, I've called it the most fascinating cemetery on the Western Front, and of course I do that to create a little bit of interest, but I've said it because I genuinely believe it. The stories here, the fact we've got the first Victoria Cross recipient of the war, the first and last Commonwealth casualties, the last Canadian casualty, you know, the man believed to be the first British casualty, somebody who is often described as the first Iron Cross recipient of the Great War, all in one cemetery. And the fact it is a beautifully laid out cemetery really does make it fascinating. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you can do the YouTube stuff here on the screen to help me out, because it really does help me, and I greatly appreciate it. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and I'm going to see you on the next video.